Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus. The organization Stand With Us just brought together more than 1,000 pro Israel participants in an international conference in Las Vegas. Among them, 600 high school and college students and many exceptional speakers. The conference was about the urgent and ongoing mission of supporting Israel and confronting anti Semitism. David Smuckler was one of the people presenting at the conference. He is the executive director of the K-12 Fairness Center for Stand With Us, an international nonpartisan education organization that supports Israel and combats anti Semitism. You can also look them up at standwithus.com. David, welcome to Never Again Is Now podcast. We're
Thanks,
thrilled
Evelyn.
to have you. Thrilled
Great
to
to be
have you
here.
on.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So you were at the Stand With Us conference in Las Vegas last week. The people who were there that I spoke with were super enthusiastic. How was it for you to be at the conference?
It was unbelievable. It was almost overwhelming in that the exuberance of the kids so energizing and really reminds us old folk, why it is that we do the work that we do. But beyond the kids, it was the first time ever there was a legal track. There was as usual, a rabbinical track. First time ever for a medical track. So really just the biggest, the best, really just truly celebratory. And I think really that encapsulated by Omer Shem Tov, who spoke and declared himself a free man. And the first very successful Stand With Us conference with no hostages in Gaza. It was just truly overwhelming.
Yes, Omer Shem Tov was a hostage, right?
Correct. Over 500 days.
Yes. Wow. And you had him there as a speaker. That's amazing. Um, so was that one of the highlights of the conference for you, or were there also other big highlights?
It certainly was a highlight for me. Seeing old friends, making new friends, but the kids, just infuse the entire thing with such energy, and they're so happy. They're so happy to be there. They're proud to be Jewish, and they're proud to be doing something to fight Jew hatred in this world. And so I can't say enough about and I can't take any credit, obviously, personally. Our events team and our high school department and all the other departments that put on the logistics department did just an overwhelmingly amazing job. Just absolute kol hakavod to all of them.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so you were with a thousand enthusiastic pro-Israel, out and loud pro-Israel Jews there in a conference center. Did that all go well, or did you meet any protests or other incidents?
I didn't see a single protest.
Oh, okay.
I think, having the location in Las Vegas, which, is a kind of a Jewish city, that has a Jewish mayor. She spoke the first morning of the conference. I think that might have had a part of it too.
Hmm.
But no, I didn't notice anything, no protest, nothing. The police who were on site, the security on site did a fabulous job. Um, Nothing was amiss.
Okay, that's good to hear for a change, right?
Yes.
So, David, what was your presentation at the conference about? And what was its main message or conclusion?
So my presentation at the conference was how to detect bias in K-12 curriculum materials. So as a director of the K-12 Fairness Center, we work directly with teachers and schools, but also with parent groups. And this particular presentation was more geared towards community. So it was for community folk and the rabbinic track, many of whom don't necessarily fully understand, nor should they, how curriculum works. So in America, it's hyper local, right? So the federal government provides very little funding for K-12 public K-12 schools, but also has few, more than usual, but few mandates. Then the state governments tend to provide more funding, and they have a lot of say in what the what the curricular frameworks are, required courses. But then the local towns and cities, they have the most say. They're the ones who are actually designing and implementing curriculum, and they provide the most funding. So it really started there, and then from there goes to where the real problem is, which is in teacher classroom materials, because most people think, teachers, they have a curriculum, they just teach the curriculum. But as a former teacher, I was a high school English teacher for 12 years and then an assistant principal and a principal. Teachers, we know that we have 180 days, maybe 5 periods a day, and we have to come up with activities and materials for each of those periods. And so it can be very stressful for a teacher to have to come up with materials for what they're teaching. And so they tend to rely on AI, as many of us do, or Google. Sometimes they'll get curriculum from websites like Teacher Pay Teachers, which it's completely unvetted, and teachers can sell and buy lesson plans. Some of them, rife with typos, and so there's a huge opportunity for, and not in a good way, a negative opportunity for bad biased materials to make their way into classrooms. And so my presentation was really from the point of view of a parent or a community member. How can you be aware of what's going on in the curriculum, and what can you do about it once you discover some of these types of things?
And can you tell us something about that? What kind of bias do parents come across, or students come across uh,
So
in the
yeah,
classroom? And we're talking K to 12
we're
for
talking
those
K through 12,
which is kindergarten
through
to end of
12th
high
grade,
school, right?
right, through the end
Right.
of high school.
Yeah. So what do they come across in terms of bias in the lessons
Yeah.
they follow?
Well, so as a former teacher, teachers know that our job is to teach kids how to think and not what to think.
Hmm.
And one of the best ways of doing that in the classroom, especially in a social studies classroom, is to use primary sources, right? So
Hmm.
you might use Israel's Declaration of Independence or Hamas's charter and have students do the heavy lifting of evaluation, analysis, creation, synthesis. But for whatever reason, we're finding that a lot of teachers are presenting the incidents, whether it's about the war or about the Middle East or about the history of the region, they're presenting slideshows many times that tell kids exactly what to think, and they are full of the anti-Zionist libels that we know, the genocide libel, the apartheid libel, and the colonizer libel.
Wow.
And sometimes that explicitly, calling Israel a colonizer state, right, on a slideshow for all the students to see. And sometimes it's a little more subtle. So we saw one slideshow from a school in Wisconsin, and the images were chosen were biased. So you saw soldiers fighting kids with rocks rather than Hamas, which is an army with rockets and guns. So everything from really subtle, almost subconscious imagery to actual anti-Zionism libels. So it really runs a gamut, and it's really across America, and even in elementary schools and middle schools.
Wow. I find this shocking to hear, especially when we realize that if K to 12 students, pupils, when they're so young and they get this negative, like bad image about, that Israel is a bad state at its core from its beginning, that it's genocidal and apartheid, and that when they get this anti-Zionism fed at a young age, how will they think later on as Americans, as adult Americans,
Sure,
about
they've
Israel?
yeah they've already had it from social media, and social media has been a huge part of the problem. I think what's changed since the last war with Hamas in 2014, which we saw a lot of the same types of libels happen, is the algorithms are different. So there are algorithms now that bring you more and more extreme content of what it is that you're watching. And it's been shown that TikTok's algorithm was muting pro-Israel voices and amplifying pro-Hamas voices. And it's just kids get inundated with it, and it's hard to get away from it. And then you go to school and you're in a classroom, and your teachers are presenting this as truth. It's scary stuff, and I think it's a complete inversion of what the purpose of education is supposed to be. Education is supposed to inspire the love of learning in kids, and I think for many now, the purpose of education is to create activists. And how do you create an activist? You have to indoctrinate them, right? I mean, for good or for ill, that's what creates an activist. And so I think parents have to be really listening to the kind of language their teachers are speaking on parents' night, or whatever, or reading over the syllabus for the course. Um, you can sometimes see tells that this is a teacher who is trying to create an activist. And that's obviously a problem. And it's obviously a huge problem for Jew hatred, because we've seen Jew hatred explode across the country, especially since October 7th.
Yes. So it creates Jew hatred, it creates more anti Semitism, but also, as I just said, it creates an anti Israel feeling very deeply ingrained in America's youth. And I'm originally from Europe. I still have a lot of friends and family in Europe, and if I hear their stories today, after October 7 and after the war in Gaza, the general European population, and we hear the same in other parts of the world outside America, the general population is so anti-Israel. It hates Israel. It thinks it's the worst state on earth. It's the
Yeah,
most evil state on earth. If the American public starts to think like that as well, then the state of Israel and the Jewish people really have an enormous global problem. So,
absolutely. And what you're talking about is exactly how anti-Semitism is like a virus that mutates. That the origins of anti-Zionism are in the anti-Jewish religion, and in the Middle Ages in Europe, where the highest ideal is in religion. The worst thing you can be is a Jew, and then you look at it mutate into ethnicity and race. And in the latter half of the 19th century and the 20th century, where racial purity is the highest ideal, Jews are then the most unpure and unwhite. And now, you know, we live in a world where the highest ideal is human rights, and so Israel then becomes the placeholder for the Jew. And of course, now the worst country in the world, we know it's not true, is a libel. And of course, I'm not inventing this mutating virus. Rabbi Sachs has done it really well. You can find him on YouTube talking about the mutating virus of anti-Semitism. But that's how it has surfaced. And for the first time in 2024, ADL found that the majority of anti-Semitic incidents were related to anti-Zionism or anti-Israel. And so you're right in saying that's an ongoing disturbing trend in America. I mean, I grew up in the Jewish golden age of America, where we weren't afraid to wear our chais and our Stars of David. I never saw a synagogue that had a lock on the door, and never mind an armed guard. And so people still don't realize that. I talk to friends sometimes who aren't Jewish, and it doesn't really register. When that awful incident happened in Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and thankfully the security on staff were able to neutralize that threat. People were saying, "Oh, well, thank God that security guard was there," and it's thank God we did that. We have to do that. It is literally unsafe to worship as a Jew in America in 2026, and I think that should disturb everybody, not just Jewish
yeah,
people.
yes. And so absolutely. And also, and we see that in Europe even worse than in America
Yeah.
happening, and in Australia. But also, I'm wondering, will America help Israel in the future if a new generation is so anti-Israel? If when Israel needs that help, so it's a problem. Where does this anti-Zionist, this vilifying material about Israel, how does it seep into into the K to 12 curricula and classrooms. And where does it where does it come from? Is that something spontaneous,
So,
or is it something that is pushed there?
all of the above. So many times we've seen teachers' unions that have moved politically further to the left and have started to take on more and more anti-Zionist and even anti-Semitic positions publicly. I was a union leader when I was a teacher, and I was vice president for rights and responsibilities of my local union, and we were concerned with teacher work conditions, right? Salary, the length of the workday, responsibilities, and more and more teachers unions have started to get into geopolitics and taking positions on geopolitics, uh, and forgetting about everything else, which is scary. And in the days and months after October 7th, 2023, many of these different state unions had teach-ins for Palestine where K-12 teachers would gather and create lessons for students from K to 12 that were very anti-Semitic. Um, Everything from draw a Zionist, right, and it had a big nose to it, for elementary kids. To I saw one lesson that was an elementary math lesson that was based on Palestinian olives. How many olives would it take? But then embedded in the lesson were links to YouTube videos that were decrying white settler violence in Palestine. So there is a small percentage of teachers who are on purpose trying to indoctrinate kids, and I think a lot of people are looking at some of the foreign influence and money for that type of curriculum, but that's above my pay grade. I think the bulk of teachers are again, they have all these classes to prepare for. They have to come up with these classroom materials, so they're Googling and they're using AI. There have been some recent studies about AI and which of the different testing each of the different AI popular engines, right? The ChatGPT and Claude and Grok. And I've seen mixed things, but certainly cannot be trusted to come up with unbiased lesson plans without a human eye looking at it. And so one of the things that we do when we give professional development to teachers is to show them how to make sure that their lessons aren't biased, how to build tools that they can use with their students as a regular classroom activity to evaluate sources for bias.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we want to see happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, back for a moment, if I may, to the teachers' unions. You saw these Teachers for Palestine work group start to create pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel lesson material, teaching material. But are you aware of any organizations from outside the union that are working on those unions to start this kind of initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, Stand With Us did a recent expose of Teach for Palestine curriculum, and that can be found on our website.
Hmm.
There are others, if you look at the history of ethnic studies in California, which is, could be a whole separate and probably should be its whole separate podcast. When that initial curriculum was being proposed, there was a group formed called the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies, and their version of the curriculum was so anti-Semitic it was shelved. But that coalition still exists, and many of them are vendors that are now doing professional development for teachers in schools that huge contracts. And so parents should pay attention to who are the vendors who are performing professional development in their districts. Sometimes you have to go through the board docs to be able to figure that out. But if you're a community member, you have the right to look at the board documents for your school board and see who's making these decisions and how. And many times there are committees that people can join, a curriculum committee, a handbook committee, a hiring committee. And so there's tons of ways for people in the community to make sure that their voice is heard beyond just a public comment period at a board meeting, which honestly has mixed results. I don't know. Boards are used to hearing a lot of people complaining at open comment periods at board meetings. And so you might not get the most traction from your 3 minutes there as you could if you're willing to put in some time in your schools, in your districts.
So it's, yeah. Well, later on in this conversation, we'll talk about what parents, what our listeners can do. And you already mentioned some of that. So, but we'll talk more about that. Okay, so there are these coalitions that there's a coalition that is preparing this material also for and putting pressure on the unions and
In
so
providing professional development, yes.
yeah. And are these coalitions, these activist coalitions, are these from the hard left, from the hard right? Are they from Islamists? Where
Yeah, well, it's such an interesting question. I mean, and there are way smarter people than I am at Stand With Us who do the research and strategy and really analyze this stuff. I think what we're talking about is coming from the hard left or the extreme left. We know that anti-Semitism is follows the horseshoe theory, where the extreme right and the extreme left are much closer to people than people at the center. What we're seeing in schools, though, what I've been seeing in schools is I think coming more from the political left and from schools where people identify as progressive. And I'm not trying to make a commentary on progressive values or
no,
conservative values, but that's what we're seeing. I think in schools that are in red states, the anti-Semitism we're seeing is more exclusion of Jews and Christianity is sort of the de facto religion of the school. But a lot of the anti-Israel stuff is coming from the hard left for sure. And there are alliances between Islamists and the extreme left, which again, I'm not a geopolitical guy. I'm just a educator. So I don't want to go too far into that. But for sure, there are alliances between those groups that are trying to get materials into schools that would harm Jewish students.
right. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about how the Stand With Us K-12 Fairness Center is working against anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias in the
Sure.
schools?
Absolutely. So, one of the first things that we do is professional development for educators, for administrators, teachers, and school boards. We start with a component about Jewish identity because we find that most people don't know who the Jews are. And if you don't know who the Jews are, then you don't understand anti-Semitism and you don't understand anti-Zionism. And so every one of our professional development activities starts with that component and then a practical component. So if you're in an administrative training, it's everything from bullying investigations, walkouts, school newspapers, bulletin boards, teacher speech, student speech, all of that stuff. For our teacher trainings, a lot of it is focused on identifying bias in the curriculum. We also perform technical assistance for parents, teachers, and students when they face anti-Semitism in their schools. We have an intake process. There's a link on our website where people can report anti-Semitism. When it's K-12 related, it's triage, and it comes to me and some other people in my department and other departments that we work with. And then we work directly with the person, often doing anything from attending meetings with them if necessary, writing letters. In really egregious cases, we'll refer it to our legal department. We've also been doing a lot of training of community groups how to better form relationships or how to form better relationships with your K-12 district so that you can better prevent and respond to anti-Semitism. We have a K-12 educator network, which is existing to provide space for K-12 teachers to have affinity space, share resources, and also come together for calls to action. Part of that is starting Jewish Affairs caucuses, hopefully in all 50 states. Right now, we've helped Jewish teachers, form Jewish Affairs caucuses in their state unions in Pennsylvania, Oregon, Washington, California, Colorado, and Michigan's coming on board, Illinois, a few other states. So that's really exciting work. And then we're also doing curriculum review and policy analysis. Sometimes it's a parent or community member who calls on us to take a look at a school curriculum or policy. And sometimes the school district will consult with us and ask us to do it. I would say that the sort of perfect example of success of how this works, we worked with a group of community members in Connecticut who were very, in Southwest Connecticut, Fairfield County, who were very interested in fighting anti-Semitism in their schools. And we helped to train them to form a strong relationship with their district. And then as a result of that relationship, they brought us in and we trained all of the administrators in the entire district. And then as a result of that, it's not a one and done. When things happen in the district, we'll get a principal to call us or a superintendent to call us and ask, hey, this just happened. What do you think we should do? And so it's an ongoing relationship between the community, us, the school, and when all things work perfectly, that's the ideal. But at the end of the day, it comes down to community members. There's no stormtroopers who are going to come into your school and force your school to, drop this curriculum or adopt this curriculum. The only power that we have is soft power relationships. And so, it's people might want a quick resolution. You have to force them to stop doing that. At the end of the day, again, we can't force anybody to do anything. We can apply our lawyers when that's appropriate, but for most of the situations we face, having strong relationships with the people in your district and schools is the best way to prevent and respond to anti-Semitism in K-12.
Okay. So this success story started with, you mentioned community members or the community. What do you mean with the community? Is that the Jewish community or the
It
school
was
community?
Jewish community, but in the best cases, they build bridges and have broad coalitions, not just to Jewish people, but also others who care about institutional neutrality, right? They want the curriculum to be unbiased. They want their kids to learn how to think, not what to think. And so it is very effective when you've got a coalition of Jewish families and others who come together for this.
Yeah.
In many communities, though, it's Jewish family associations. They may call themselves a JFA. Sometimes they have names, sometimes they don't have names, but they are people who either have kids in schools or recently had kids in schools. They're aware of what's going on and they want to fight it. And we help them organize so that they can better fight it.
That is fantastic. So, and you arm them with knowledge, you help them with taking action at the authorities level, and if necessary, you provide them with legal support. That's fantastic to hear, and I think a big privilege of the American Jewish community. I cannot imagine in Europe, Jewish communities are much smaller there, that they would have facilities like that available where they face the same problems. So that's wonderful to hear that Stand With Us provides that possibility to Jewish communities locally and to parents and teachers probably. So let's move on to some a legislative issue that is going on right now. The California Assembly member Robert Garcia recently introduced Assembly Bill 2159 that would change California's existing law against anti-Semitism in K-12 schools. Stand With Us wants to keep the existing law as is and condemns the new bill. Can you tell us what the new bill proposes and why Stand With Us is against it?
Yes. So Stand With Us was pretty aghast at this. We're pretty aghast at this bill, which really serves to strip down the protections that were enacted in law with AB 715. which not just worked against worked for fighting anti-Semitism, but all kinds of religious and shared national ancestry-based discrimination. What this bill seeks to do is to make basically three major changes. One would be to remove all the references to the Biden United States national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which, based on the fact that it relies on what they say relies on the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition for anti-Semitism, and it's based on a total lie. The speech basically their bill says that this definition of anti-Semitism includes political speech critical of Israel and advocacy for Palestinians, and that's a total lie. In fact, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism allows for criticism of Israel and Israeli policy as long as you don't do the three Ds, right? Demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. If you hold Israel to a double standard, that or to a standard that you don't hold any other country in the world, then yeah, that is anti-Semitism. The second thing the bill seeks to do is to remove the anti-Semitism coordinator position from being appointed by the governor. Which one thing that's really kind of kooky about that is the previous bill created five different anti-discrimination coordinators, one for LGBTQ, one for I think racial. I'm not sure of all the five of them, but the only one that they want to remove from the governor appointing is the anti-Semitism one. And then the third point, which is yeah, I used to teach 1984, and so I'm familiar with things like weasel words, where words have vague definitions. The words that they're fighting, which are enshrined in 715, factually accurate, right? They want to remove vague and subjective terms like anti-bias, right? They want viewpoint neutral teaching, and that's a problem for Garcia and the people who are funding his bill, many of whom are known anti-Semitic groups like CARE and
CARE?
other.
What is CARE?
CARE is the Committee for Anti-Islam. I'm not sure what they're.
Oh, the Council of American Islamic Relations.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
What is with
so
them? What is with them
what is with them?
in this
Again,
context?
I'm not a policy an analyst, and I don't want to like get too far outside of my area of expertise. But they've said and done things that have been considered anti-Semitic.
But what is their role in this issue?
They are co-sponsors of the bill.
Oh,
Yes, along with Jewish Voices for Peace, which celebrated the attacks of October 7th, 2023.
right.
So basically, their concern is that that factually accurate, right? That could be discriminatory against Palestinian liberation of some sort in some way. Also, accepted standards of professional responsibility rather than advocacy, personal opinion, bias, or partisanship. Those aren't vague words to me. Personal opinion and fact, I think it's pretty clear what is a fact and what's an opinion. Maybe it's difficult for people, but I'm not uncomfortable with that language being in the
Well,
bill.
these days, to say that I'm a woman is an opinion, not a fact anymore, right?
Well, no, I don't know if I want to comment on that. That seems like um, yeah, I think we're definitely living in an era where people have their own set of facts, but words have meaning. I was a high school English teacher. The word genocide has a meaning. The word apartheid has a meaning. Colonizer, that has a meaning. And when you're twisting those words and using them in ways that they don't describe, that's dishonest. And so to me, this is a bill that seeks to allow teachers and teachers unions to teach dishonestly based on their personal opinion, bias, or partisanship.
Yes. So if I try to summarize what you have against this bill that is now waiting in the Assembly of California to be voted on, I guess, is or to be discussed in the Assembly is what you have against it, if I understand you well, is that it wants to change the definition of anti-Semitism that the state of California currently
It
uses.
wants to weaken protections, and it wants to remove references to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It doesn't propose as far as I know, it doesn't propose an alternate definition of anti-Semitism.
Okay. So it wants to get rid of the protection of um, Israel from being demonized and
Correct.
being called anti-Semitic names, and it wants to it wants to allow anything, any opinion. I think, right, when it's personal.
Well, as a former teacher and a union member, I always enjoyed my free speech as a citizen, but I never in a million years thought that I had free speech in my classroom. I understood that the kids in front of me were captive and that for them, what I said was government speech. And so teachers' unions today, many of them are taking the position that teachers should have academic freedoms similar to college, and that's completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
In K-12 education, we again need to teach kids how to think
Yeah.
and not tilt the scale by telling them what to think.
Yes.
And teachers should not and do not enjoy free speech in the classroom in front of their students.
Right. You're against teachers using
Absolutely.
their position as to indoctrinate students.
That's right.
Also, what you have against this bill, if I understand you well, is the organizations that supported. One of them is the Council of American Islamic Relations. I want to add to that the Council of American Islamic Relations has been in a lawsuit, in a court case, in 2008, the Holy Land Foundation trial, has been listed as a co-conspirator of Hamas. So they're linked to Hamas. So they are supporting this new bill, right? And I think that should ring an alarm bell. You rightfully do so, I think.
Well, they've positioned themselves through marketing to be considered like Islam's version of the ADL. Meanwhile, true to all inversions, the ADL has been smeared and has been now considered unreliable. The NEA had a vote and they almost banned ADL as a resource. The National Education Association, which is the nation's largest teachers union with over 3 million members. So, again, I don't have the background to be able to speak to whether or not they are Hamas. That being said, I've heard what you have said, and they have, undergone some kind of, I don't know, I think a good marketing campaign because people aren't aware of who they are.
Yes, yes. There also, I mean, you can look it up. You can see the court, the trial, the papers of the trial, the official papers, and you see them listed as a co-conspirator of the Holy Land Foundation, which was Hamas in America. Also, the Council of American Islamic Relations is founded by members of Hamas. So that should ring a bell in my mind. Um, Next question, David. What can our listeners do against anti Semitism in K to 12 schools?
So, if you have children in the schools, you should be paying attention to what it is they're learning. Ask them questions. Many schools now require teachers to post their materials online. You should, if you have access to those, absolutely look through them. Ask the teachers questions if you have concerns. Clearly you might not have to worry about your kid's 11th grade math class, but if they're doing world history, or it's a ancient civilizations class or a current events class, those are some things that you want to even go a deeper dive in and really look at the syllabi and really look at what the teacher has prepared for the course. But beyond that, to spend time building relationships with your K-12 districts. And that doesn't mean going in and asking for things. It means going in and saying, hi, I want to introduce myself and this is what I care about. and that's it, right? And then leaving, and building from there, right? So that you're starting just based on building a relationship. And then ideally, when you have these relationships, you'll be called on to serve on committees. And most schools will have a curriculum review committee where they'll bring community members on or parents on. PTA is a group, or school councils that advise principals. Every school has a school handbook that determines the code of conduct for students. Does it call out anti-Semitism specifically when you also call out anti-Black racism, homophobia, misogyny, etc.? You can be a volunteer, go on that committee and help influence it. And so at the end of the day, we at Stand With Us can help support and provide resources and guidance to community members. But the relationships have to happen locally, and they have to be fed and maintained. And so at the end of the day, it comes to dedicated community members who care about the quality of education, not just for their kids and not just for Jewish kids, but for all kids, because we know indoctrination is wrong and it harms everyone.
Right. So those are very concrete and useful guidelines for parents who want to do something actively against anti-Semitism in schools. Our show is called "Never Again Is Now" podcast. I think if you agree with me that "Never Again" is now, then it's of the utmost importance that as a parent you look into the school material of your kids and grandkids, that you reserve some time to develop relationships, as you say, with the authorities that make the curricula, that make the teaching materials, and influence them and advocate for Jewish safety. If we don't do that, then what kind of a country will your kids and grandkids live in as Jews, in the future? Because education is highly influenced by anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist forces, and we have to push back. Do you agree?
I do. We live in an era where conspiracy theories are rampant, and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are at their base a conspiracy theory. And schools need to prepare kids to be able to make sense of what is true and what is real in this world. Not an easy task.
David, I want to thank you for this amazing conversation
My
and
pleasure.
all the knowledge you presented to us and all the expertise. And I want to wish you lots of good luck with all the work in the future you will be doing in this area. For more information, our listeners can look at www.standwithus.com. And I also want to thank our listeners. If you want to know more about this podcast or to listen to past episodes, go to our Never Again Is Now podcast channels on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeart. And please speak up against anti Semitism whenever you can.